Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar between the Financial Mail and the Open Secrets. We are in conversation today about something very close to all our hearts, key institutions in our country. And I want to begin with a quote from a Financial Mail cover dating back to February 2015. It's pertinent, but it's also a bit of a cheeky plug. It goes like this. Jacob Zuma's presidency has taken on a particular flavor. Exposés of capricious political interference in important arms of the state, such as the NPA, the police, and the intelligence services, have become commonplace. There is little shock factor left in the abuse of power and processes committed by his friends in these institutions in his name. And there is no parallel with any other SA president in the extent to which he has personally benefited from holding office. We are now almost a decade after that piece was written, and we are in the process of trying to rebuild these institutions that were destroyed. I have two really interesting and important people with me today, the Director of Open Secrets, Henny van Vuuren, and investigator Raisa Patha. They have done some really important work collating the findings of the state capture report and various other reports on state capture, as well as on the NPA and the police. We come from that period of intense instability that was deliberately inflicted on us. This wasn't by accident. This wasn't. It was very purposeful. It was very, and it was aimed at a very particular. It had a very particular aim, and that aim was to shield particular people from accountability, from corruption charges, from corruption allegations. And during that time, our institutions, the institutions that our constitution formed and guarantees to protect South African citizens, were deliberately repurposed for the ends of this small group of ruling elite. The most serious effects are those that we're living with now, are those seen financially in our SOEs. You know, we are accustomed now to rolling blackouts. State capture was partly responsible for that. But for me, the most insidious impact of the state capture years are on our criminal justice system. We have high levels of crime, high levels of gender-based violence, and all those crimes are difficult to prosecute currently. They are difficult to bring before the criminal justice system because our police, our Hawks, and our NPA has been hobbled to such an extent. Open Secrets has put together a really neat and I must say a really concise report on exactly who the individuals are that are still within the NPA today, who need to be brought to book and who need to account for repurposing our institutions and who need to account for the damage they have done to our institutions. I'm going to hand you over now to Raisa to give us a quick summary of that report, which outlines the damage done to both the NPA and the Hawks. Raisa?
Thank you so much, Natasha, and welcome to everybody who's joined this webinar. So today we launch our report called Bad Cops, Bad Lawyers, and this delves into the officials in the NPA and Hawks who have essentially been accused of serious misconduct throughout the years. Now, earlier, Natasha mentioned, that there were officials within these agencies who essentially shielded corrupt actors from facing prosecution and investigation. And our report seeks to name these prosecutors and Hawks investigators who, through their decision-making and actions, shielded high-profile and influential people from corruption allegations and from facing justice for state capture crimes. So, for example, one of the people we talk about is Andrew Chaoke, who is highly powerful as the Joburg prosecution's boss for the NPA. Now, Chaoke is seized with matters, for example, such as PRASA. He is responsible for overseeing the PRASA prosecution and investigation in some regard. And to date, he has faced no accountability for allegations, for example, for delaying justice in the Brian Hlongwa case, where the former health MEC faces charges of up to 1.2 billion in corruption allegations. And Flongwa, the case has been going on since 2006. The NPA has been seized with it since 2012. And to date, we have no indication of when this matter will conclude. This matter is Chaoke's responsibility. This is just one of the prosecutors that we've investigated. In the Hawks, there's a Hawks police officer called Alfred Kana. Alfred Kana was promoted to the head of the commercial crimes unit in the Hawks, and he has been accused of delaying investigations at PRASA. Popo Molefe, the then PRASA chair, said in an affidavit before the courts that Kana's actions deliberately stalled the Hawks investigation into PRASA. Yet we have seen no action from the Hawks to hold people like Alfred Kana to account. So essentially, our report looks at the officials inside these agencies to say, hey, if we're going to reform the NPA and the Hawks after the Zuma era, we need to ensure that these agencies are holding their own to account. If they do not hold their own to account, then how can we trust them to hold perpetrators of state capture crimes to account?
Thank you, Raisa. That was very concise. And you mentioned Andrew Chaoke there. Can you tell me who exactly he is? I want to know how important he is before and currently.
So Chaoke has been important for a very long time. I think that he's been Joburg's head of prosecutions, public prosecutions, for at least 8 to 10 years. So he's been in that seat for quite some time, and he was there before Zuma came into power. So his appointment, what we're trying to say is that he is an experienced prosecutor. He knows the ins and outs of the Joburg High Court and the prosecutorial system. But over the years, he's made a number of decisions that have delayed important and high-profile prosecutions. It's not limited to the Flongwa case. For example, his decision-making delayed the conviction of former crime intelligence boss Richard Mdluli. He was also involved in the prosecution of KZN Hawks boss Johan Boysen. And we know that the Boysen case lacked evidence. There was a court judgment saying that there was no evidence, there wasn't sufficient evidence to prosecute Boysen, yet these prosecutors went ahead and did it. Interestingly, Chaoke went to the Zondo Commission along with other prosecutors to say that we did nothing wrong, we were not involved in state capture, and we believe that these charges were brought legitimately. The NPA, however, in its own affidavits, and this was an affidavit written by the NPA's then head of administration, Karen van Rensburg, says that these people were part of state capture at the NPA. And so if you have an NPA head, a senior official, saying these things, then it begs the question, why haven't the NPA put these prosecutors on suspension? Why are they still employed in senior positions, such as Chaoke, who is the head of prosecutions in Joburg, when they should be placed on suspension pending an outcome or disciplinary action into their conduct?
Raisa. Chaoke he's a deputy public prosecutor. That requires the president to launch a commission of inquiry into his conduct. Am I right? And does the NPA have to recommend that? And is there any reason why they haven't yet?
Yeah, so Chaoke is the director of public prosecutions. And so, yes, his is a presidential appointment, much as like the head of the ID is a presidential appointment, the NDPP post is a presidential appointment. So yes, the NPA should recommend that the president institutes a commission of inquiry. And, this has been done before. For example, Nomsobo Jiba and Lawrence Mukwebe famously faced a commission of inquiry. Lucy Pikoli faced a commission of inquiry. This has been done throughout our history. And so a prosecutor like Chaoke, who faces the allegations he faces, should also be the subject of an inquiry. However, the NPA can also do its own disciplinary action. To prosecute somebody without having sufficient evidence is a violation of the NPA's prosecution policy. The NPA Act also says that the NPA should have a structure to discipline or to hear grievances regarding prosecutors. In December 2021, the NPA told us that it was setting up an ethics office to deal with these types of allegations. But since then, we've heard no feedback on whether this office has been established or not. And it's important for the NPA to confirm this. Chaoke, Stella Mayama, the prosecutors mentioned in this report led cases that interrupted or that disrupted public trust in the NPA. It eroded our trust in the NPA's ability to do our job. Seno Mayama, for example, was involved in the SARS rogue unit case. He was involved in the Gordon pension payout case, in prosecuting those matters, the McBride case. These were all cases that eroded public trust in the NPA and made people say, hey, why are they charging these officials? These officials are actually investigating state capture cases. So why are they still employed, and why has the NPA not been transparent about what it's doing? Those are the questions we pose to the NPA.
So Raisa, Chaoke Maema, you also mentioned Tory Pretorius in your report, and he was quite crucial, right? He was the head of the PCLU, which is the Priority Litigation Crime. It's the PCLU. You can flesh it out for me. He was quite crucial, right? Tell us a little bit about Tory Pretorius, and also can you go into a little bit more detail about the actual cases? What was the consequence, for instance, of Anwar Dramat's removal from the Hawks? What was the consequence of the rogue unit report, the decimation of SARS? What was the consequence of Robert McBride, the attempted prosecution of Robert McBride? The impact of what these prosecutors actually did?
Yeah, I mean, the acronyms in law enforcement, it's a mess, it's a stumble. So yeah, Tory Pretorius, and actually his case is quite interesting because he was appointed as the acting head of the Priority Crimes Litigation Unit under Sean Abrams's watch. And again, in her affidavit to the Zondo Commission, Karen van Rensburg says that his appointment might have been irregular. And she quotes, for example, the current head of the IED, Andrea Johnson, overhearing a phone call between Abrams and Pretorius, where Pretorius says, if it wasn't for you, I would never have got this job. And in a meeting, Andrea Johnson also reports to, hearing that Pretorius was thanked by Jibba for always being there for her during trying times. So it's just curious because both Jibba and Abrams were very much associated with political interference in the NPA and with misconduct in the NPA. In his time at the PCLU, Pretorius was accused of eroding the mandate of the PCLU. So essentially what the PCLU is meant to be doing up until this day is it's meant to be investigating and prosecuting cases that affect the security of the state. So these would be offenses related to certain acts, such as nuclear weapons, terrorism, state security, information. All of these types of laws in our country, the violations of those laws would be investigated and prosecuted by the PCLU. When Abrams and Pretorius had the reins over the PCLU, they were accused of investigating and prosecuting cases like the McBride case, the Boyson case, the SARS rogue unit case, the Gordon pension payout case. And it's kind of quite explosive because in Van Rensburg's affidavit to the Zondo Commission, she says that Tory Pretorius was the one who formulated the charges against Gordon over Ivan Pilay's pension payout at SARS. When these allegations or when this charge sheet emerged in 2016, it was highly explosive. This was one of the reasons why the NPA was accused of political interference and being weaponized for political goals, was because Gordon at that time was very outspoken against state capture and the Gordon and the Zuma administration. And yet now the NPA was charging him seemingly for no valid reason, according to reports at the time. So it's interesting that Tory Pretorius was the one who kind of had the idea to charge Gordon. He has since retired from the NPA, but we believe that he should still face an investigation into his conduct because he played such a crucial role in these cases. Natasha, you asked a really great question about the importance of these cases and the damaging effect they had on our institutions. So when the SARG rogue unit allegations emerged, they were essentially saying that there was a unit within SARS which was illegally spying on law enforcement agencies in the NPA. And the effect of this was that these allegations targeted a unit within SARS that was seized with sort of investigating tax crimes of high profile and politically influential people, connected people. The tobacco industry was one of these sort of industries that they regulated. And so by targeting such an influential unit of SARS, essentially they were saying that this unit, who had the capacity to investigate crimes emanating from state capture and businesses linked to state capture, was in itself corrupt. And these allegations were thoroughly debunked. They were proved to be false. There was a KPMG report saying that, the rogue unit existed, and KPMG then retracted that. There was a Sunday Times report saying that the rogue unit existed. The Sunday Times retracted that. But for some reason, these prosecutors at the NPA who were involved in this case still believe that their conduct was warranted and legitimate. And they said as much at the Zondo Commission.
So even though, there's no remorse, in other words, as well. Yeah,
absolutely.
So Raisa, what was very interesting about Tory Pretorius, you said he's retired now, so it's difficult for the NPA, and I read in your report as well that that's actually what they told you when you asked them about it, that he has retired. So is there any disciplinary cases that you know about? Look, I understand the difficulty though around employee disciplinary cases. They have to be confidential, but surely this has a massive public interest element to it, because, like you said, it erodes the trust of the general public in these institutions. So is it fair then for the NPA to hide behind that employer-employee relationship with regard to the cases against, or the internal action, if any, that's been taken against these individuals?
So we know, for example, that Chaoke is being investigated, and all the prosecutors who worked on the Boyson case are being investigated by the NPA. The issue is that the NPA hasn't said when these investigations began, what these prosecutors are accused of exactly, and when these investigations will conclude. So in December last year, the NPA confirmed, it didn't name the prosecutors, but it confirmed that there was an investigation taking place. When we did our reports, they confirmed that it was the prosecutors on the Boyson case who were under investigation. But as yet, we have no clarity on when this investigation will conclude. If it was already happening in December, it's now 8 months later, and apparently they're still being investigated. We must also remember that the NPA did an internal investigation on the Boyson case, asking whether Abrams and Jibba had made valid decisions in deciding to charge Boyson with racketeering. So that investigation concluded in 2019. So the NPA essentially already investigated the Boyson case. And yet the prosecutors involved seem to be in this endless investigation, and Chaoke is not suspended, Mayena is not suspended, and Tory Pretorius has now retired in May this year. So when do we see them held to account?
That's the difficulty. And so we have a new prosecution boss, Advocate Shamila Batoy. She's been in the post for 3 years and 5 months, if I calculated it just to be accurate on that. And she promised a clean out, right? She promised a clean out immediately as she entered the doors of the NPA. We interviewed her this week. There was also little detail on the issues you raised. Do you think she should be doing more?
Absolutely. So I don't want to draw any sort of doubt on the intentions of the NPA management. I think that the NPA management wants the NPA to thrive, and I think that they believe that they're doing everything they can to rehabilitate the NPA. However, recently it feels that there's been a lack of transparency from the NPA about what it's doing. So I read the Financial Mail front page article today. It quotes the NDPP as saying that by the end of this year, there will be 9 seminal cases that will be enrolled. And that's a lot of cases before the end of the year. But last year, in 2021, the NDPP said the same thing, that in a few months' time, we'll see a few cases enrolled. The same promise was made in April this year, that within 6 months, we'll see cases enrolled. We're now 5 months into that 6 months promise, and we as yet haven't seen any new big cases enrolled. So the question remains is, when are we going to see conviction and prosecutions of state capture cases? When are those who aided and abetted corruption at ESCOM, for example, going to be brought to book? We did a report earlier this year looking at the so-called low-hanging fruit, the easy sort of cases that the NPA could pursue in relation to PRASA, SAA, SARS, but they haven't yet pursued these cases. And the question remains is why? Why are we not seeing the state capture cases enrolled in courts? In terms of the prosecutors, the NPA also hasn't been transparent. It was only when we started investigating this report and putting direct questions to them about each of these prosecutors that they sort of confirmed that there was an investigation taking place. But there needs to be more transparency with the public about what it's doing, particularly what it's doing inside to hold its own to account.
And a big part of prosecutions, a big part of the NPA's work is the strength or the quality of the docket they receive from the Hawks, right? From the police, from the investigating officer. But we see from your report that the Hawks are also in a bit of a state. We have really senior officials in the Hawks that have been implicated in serious allegations, and they to a large extent they've not been held to account. We have Brigadier Taba from the Crimes Against the State unit. Tell us a little bit about him. I mean, I think his story for me was so insidious.
Yeah, so Brigadier Kaba was appointed the head of the CATS, the Crimes Against the State unit, by Burning Ntlumeza, his then boss. And Ntlumeza, as we know, was very much the jibber of the Hawks. He was accused of making appointments that ultimately were against the interests of justice and that served potential political agendas. And Kaba, the CATS are meant to be sort of like the PCLU. They work hand in hand together to investigate and prosecute cases that affect the security of the state. And what we know is that Kaba did not abide by this mandate. He followed orders to investigate the rogue unit allegations, to investigate the Gordon pension payout allegations, all the SARS matters. And when he appeared before the State Capture Commission, he was like, I don't think I did anything wrong. I think I followed my mandate and I was following orders of my superiors. And this is an official who remains employed as head of the Crimes Against the State unit of the CATS. And the Hawks, when we try to ask them questions about what they've done, they decline to respond. So again, there's a lack of transparency about justice and accountability within our law enforcement agencies.
And we had the Hawks head, General Labia, this week telling us there's over 22,000 cases of corruption being investigated. It's a little bit difficult to be enthusiastic about that when we don't really know what's happening inside the Hawks. What about Major General Jan Mabula, the Pahlani case, the former police commissioner, the case against the former police commissioner? That was, I think, it's another stinky case that that I just can't believe hasn't been followed up and acted on, especially with regards to Major General Mabula.
Absolutely. I mean, the Pahlani case involves allegations against the former police commissioner, Khomotso Pahlani, of corruption. And there was a famous moment where Pahlani's home in Sable Hills in Gauteng was raided by police. And there were reports, of this massive sound system and this massive home, etc. What essentially happened was that Jan Mabula, who is a senior police official, or who was a senior police official in the Northwest, intervened in an investigation against Pahlani. Pahlani was being investigated by IPID and by then IPID boss Robert McBride. And essentially what happened was that in the Northwest, a team of Hawks officers were kind of brought into Gauteng to lead a counter investigation to the IPID investigation, seemingly protect Pahlane from the allegations that were made against him and from the IPID investigation. And so what you saw was this tussle between two key police agencies, one trying to investigate Pahlane and the other led by Mabula, who was trying to obstruct that investigation, as the evidence at the Zondo Commission shows. And to date, Mabula was never held to account. Instead, he was allowed to quietly go on to retirement. And at the time that he appeared before the Zondo Commission, he was the Deputy Police Commissioner in the Northwest, which is a very senior position for somebody who has allegations of protecting corrupt activity against him. It's also interesting, just as an aside, to note that Mabula has been accused of torture in police detention and murdering a suspect in police detention as well. The Hawks know about these allegations. IPID is investigating him on those allegations, and yet he was just allowed to retire, presumably with his pension intact.
Oh, that's hair-raising. Raisa, Jan Mabula has been charged though, right? The interesting thing for me is that the case is under one Andrew Chaoke in Joburg, who we just spent a lot of time talking about. What are the implications of that? Should we be nervous that, this guy, this is obviously, there's serious allegations against this individual, but the case is not being prosecuted by, but it falls under Andrew Chaoke, is that right?
Yes, so recently Mabula was in court for the torture allegations. And the case is being handled by Andrew Chaoke. And what is interesting is that Chaoke was sort of the coordinator of the prosecutors who prosecuted the Boyson case. And Mabula was the lead investigator on the Hawks who investigated the Boyson case. So they would have had interactions in the past. But what's really interesting, what says a lot about Chaoke's conduct as a prosecutor was that in the course of this case against Mabula, he sort of agreed over email with Mabula's attorneys that he would not prosecute the case until the NDPP and the courts had done a review of the case, as Mabula's attorney had requested. And the NPA's own leadership in court papers said that this was a dismal decision that could bring the doors of justice, that could sort of bring justice crashing down, that could collapse justice because it would lead to significant delays in the Mabula prosecution. We are now in 2022, and these allegations stem from 2006. And Chaoke's decision would have added even more delays when the agreement was made about 2 or 3 years ago. So this is the type of decision-making that we have in our prosecution authority. And it's something that we should be concerned about. It's something that Chaoke should be made to answer for, and Mabula should face justice, He should be prosecuted for the allegations that he faces, and he should also be investigated for his role in the Pahlane investigation and the delays in that case. The case is completely legitimate. Pahlane has since appeared in court. So we know that the case was a legitimate case.
Oh, thanks, Raisa. I want to take a quick question from one of the viewers. Sina says, has the NPA and SAPS seen the report? Can the Minister of Justice account in some way? This is unacceptable.
Yes, so I'm not sure yet if the NPA and SAPS have had a chance to see the report since it emerged on our website this morning. It was launched on our website this morning at 9 o'clock. So if any of our viewers haven't seen the report, please go to opensecrets.org.za and have a read. We know that, for example, they know what's contained in some of the key allegations in the report because we put questions to them. And, we know that the Financial Mail has also put questions to them after reading the front page article today. We hope that they will read it further. We plan to send the report to Parliament. So hopefully the Justice Portfolio Committee will take it seriously and will ask the NPA questions about the issues that we've raised. Parliament is important. Parliament is meant to hold the NPA to account. And if the Hawks leadership are failing, the Minister of Police can intervene to hold that leadership to account. If the minister fails, Parliament can intervene to hold that minister to account as well. So Parliament is a key institution of accountability. We know that it isn't as doing a good as job as we want it to do, but we need it to function. And if it doesn't function, we need to say, hey, we sent you this report. Have you followed up and asked the NPA to account?
hopefully we'll get some joy out of Parliament. You know, one of our readers, one of our viewers, sorry, one of our viewers, Jared Ishmael, is a private legal practitioner, and he wants to know how he can help and how he can contribute to the work that Open Secrets does. If I can bring you in here, Henny, as the director of Open Secrets, I want to bring you in on two scores with regards to Jared's question, how he can contribute and how he can assist. And also, there's an interesting section in the report on deferred prosecution agreements. And, you know, for me, it sounds like a quick win, and it was also among the recommendations in the Zondo report. Can you explain to us, because you'll explain a lot better than I will, what a deferred prosecution agreement is, and what is your view on deferred prosecution agreements?
Thanks very much, Natasha, and good to be here and with the viewers as well. Maybe just to start, I think what Raisa and colleagues at Open Secrets have done through this investigation is, I think, unearth new information, bring together the details, and we recognize that that takes the work of many people, and it takes the work of our colleagues, but we know that's the work, it's also drawing on the work of others. And so just to answer Jared's question, by that means is to say, we really welcome any support from members of the public who can bring their skills, and support doesn't always have to be money. I think we have skills and insight and expertise. And so please do have a look at our website, opensecrets.org.za, and we have a page on there with a couple of hints on how you can contact us, and also do so securely if you'd like to, but we'd love to be in touch with you. So it is definitely about collaborating to make many of these things happen. But absolutely, let's turn to this question that you raise, Natasha, and this is around what happens in terms of corporate accountability when the prosecution service in countries like South Africa fail at the very basics of accountability. And I think, what the bad cops, bad lawyers investigation really shows is, that we could get stuck in a situation where things stop moving. We don't see the kind of prosecutions which we certainly haven't seen on state capture matters. And in what really I think the result is, in part potentially, is that we start to lose our imagination. I think it's something that's quite extraordinary in South African politics, and I think we sometimes, in the doom and gloom, we underestimate what we have. We have an ability through our constitution, through the many things we have achieved as a country, to imagine another world, another way of doing things. And what we've seen in the United States and the United Kingdom in particular is a loss of that imagination. And that is in large part by, I think we would argue, if you like, a corporate capture of the justice system. It's where there's been a real planned move to limit the capacity within the criminal justice sector in places like the United States and elsewhere, in part led by lobbyists and others in big corporations, precisely because they don't want to be held accountable for their crimes. And of course, within this network of state capture, we talk about the role of bad politicians, corrupt politicians and others, but there are obviously many big corporations, both South African corporations like big South African banks and global corporations that were involved in state capture in one way or the other. So deferred prosecution agreements are basically secretive agreements that are concluded between the criminal justice authorities, as I said, in the United Kingdom and the US, where they've really spearheaded these efforts. And they say, look, you're going to pay us a fine. We're not going to make this agreement public. And in return for doing that, you're not going to do this again. And if you do it again, we'll make you pay a fine again. Now, what our investigative report shows is very clearly that in many countries where this has happened, we've seen examples of big corporations like Citibank, like British Aerospace in the United Kingdom, like HSBC, offending, entering a deferred prosecution agreement, offending again, paying a fine, and you have this extraordinary abusive relationship between corrupt corporations and the state. Those fines, Natasha, they aren't small meal. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars. And what we see as well is a practice of those big corporations basically starting to factor in the fines into the profit model in which they've developed. When HSBC was involved in facilitating the capture of the South African state with the Gupta family, and let's not forget that a lot of that cash that moved offshore traveled through bank accounts in Hong Kong, and HSBC, it's very clear, like companies like Bain and others, were very much part and parcel of the system of state capture. They were at that stage under deferred prosecution agreements not to commit similar crimes, which they committed in Mexico and other countries, in other countries that had resulted in, frankly, in the loss of lives where they work closely with drug cartels. Yeah, they work with a cartel of a different nature. And so we see a kind of a practice re-emerging. And what we're saying is, we've seen the National Director of Public Prosecutions latch onto this. Shamila Batoy has come out in a statement to say this is a grand idea. We've heard NGOs doing it, and we've certainly heard consulting companies who we believe work for some of the big corporates fronting this idea, some kind of magic that we need in South Africa. What we are saying is that this is potentially poison, because what it is going to do is it's going to mean that the prosecuting authority will arrive at Parliament and say, look at this amazing work we've done. We've managed to deal with all of these crimes involving big corporations, but we won't be setting the precedent. We won't be holding the heads of those corporations and others accountable. And of course, it's bad for the country. It's bad for business people who want to do things better in our country. And we want to believe that there are folks in the private sector who want to do things differently. And so I think what we're saying, it's crucial that we can't have these secretive type of agreements. And there are a couple of things we can do, I think, Natasha, to point out, is that, yes, we're saying we can look at things like, so firstly, move the idea of the deferred prosecution agreements off the table, because they simply haven't worked in other jurisdictions. Then if we're going to look at out-of-court settlements, we are in favor of those as long as they only deal with civil matters, not with criminal matters. And there has to be certain consequences for the executive, consequences for the company. And those consequences can't exclude prosecution of the bosses. That means the board members and the board chairs, in the same way that we think the former head of state should be prosecuted for the corruption that they were involved in state capture. We can't have, quite frankly, Ned Bank and Mike Brown being implicated in state capture the one day, and these individuals reappearing and lecturing our country about how we are on the precipice of things falling apart, as he's done recently in the business press, when these were folks that were really there during the state capture period, where these big corporations were implicated in those crimes. And of course, paying back can't only be like Bain has done, Natasha, which is this idea that you can pay back some cash, which is really the profits of your crime. KPMG has done the same thing. But what they really do is they're trying to throw a dog a bone here. What we want, and I think what we need to be demanding as a public of our institutions, like the National Prosecuting Authority, is that damage must be calculated as social damage. Damage is the millions of folks today who have been driven further into poverty and rely increasingly on social grants as their only means of survival. Also, because of the inequity that's resulted from state capture, we need to see that kind of restitution take place from the side of the corporations, and the imagination from our legislators who can think that we need guidelines on how that should work. But we need imagination as well, I think, from the side of the NPA and others, to actually come up with a plan about how they want to go about this. But again, I think that the idea, to underscore the point, these deferred prosecution agreements, I think, as we argue in this report, are some kind of a quick fix remedy. They're going to look good on paper for the public officials when they report to the political heads, but whether they'll change anything in our society, we doubt it, and that will mean that we'll have the next round of state capture just around the corner.
Sure. It's a difficult one, Henny. You're absolutely right. What we don't want to do is, see this deferred prosecutions become like it is in the UK, for instance. I see that you do make quite extensive recommendations on what should be done in this regard that you have submitted to Zondo, and it can be found in the report. There's some really interesting initiatives here What about what the UK government has done to Bain over its work in South Africa? The UK government has said that it will not do any business with Bain and Company for 3 years. Granted, it's retrospectively, but because of the damage it inflicted on SARS, which resulted in South Africa's first, partly contributed to South Africa's first VAT increase in over 2 decades, and also to a massive 100 billion rand hole in the fiscus. What do you think of something like that, where the South African government could say, well, we won't do business with Bain, we won't do business with KPMG for a certain amount of time? Do you think that would work?
I think absolutely, it's crucial, Natasha, that we get serious about this. Right now, there's a lot of mouthing, and it's all fun and games to talk about how Bain has responded. Politicians like to talk about it. They're a pretty easy target. But until you actually do something, nothing changes. I mean, what's extraordinary? Let's first say this: you've got a right-wing Tory government in the United Kingdom. You've got Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's is a sort of smarmy mouth politician who's best known for lounging around on the benches of Westminster, and he's the guy that holds Bain to account. I mean, he's the guy. You've got to say to our entire political leadership, are you all asleep on the job? Where? And quite frankly, that's the question to the leadership of the NPA. Have you really you've got everything in front of you? Books have been written about Bain. I mean, you've got Edward Kisvetter down the road, who's prepared to tell you in fine detail about what's happened in Bain, and the heads of Portia Derby at Transnet and many others can talk about the corporations that have been involved in state capture in their companies. Why are you not doing anything about it? And I think absolutely, we've made the recommendation in this report that we should see a potential for a debarment. So we don't want government to be doing any business with these corporations for a period of time. And I think that the call to ban Bain is something that we need to get behind. We need to ban Bain. We need to look at banning McKinsey. We need to look at banning KPMG. There's a host of companies. We need to ban HSBC. Now, they don't like this. And the first thing they'll tell us is, there's jobs on the line. How can you do this to us? Well, we have no problem about sending somebody to prison in this society very often for stealing 6 loaves of bread at the local garage shop. But when it comes to corporations like this, I think the argument is made that there needs to be a special way of treatment. And so we need to see this from the side of government very clearly. I think a strong message about how we deal with these things. And equally, we argue that we need to see that from the peers of these corporations. How is it that business leadership South Africa allows Bain back into the fold, as we've seen last year? What have they done to, frankly, ostracize some of these corporations for a period? And again, I'm going to use him because he's an easy target. Mike Brown was the head of Nedbank during state capture. Nedbank is deeply complicit in the crimes of state capture. There he is today in the leadership of business, of one of the country's most important business bodies. And it's easy to focus on some of those individuals, but we have to talk about the individuals and name those corporations and find a way to say to them that, your conduct is not acceptable. You are abusers in our society. You've basically created the environment for violence against our people, and there has to be some kind of consequence for that. And that does mean not only telling them you're not going to be let back in the room, but it means, for example, the JSE, we would argue, needs to look at the delisting of corporations that are implicated in crimes like state capture for a period. And until we can show real consequence like that, I don't think that we're going to see the system change. And it's ultimately, I think, Natasha, the argument that we make is these aren't cheap shots at individuals by any means in any institution, whether they're a public institution or a private institution. We need the system to change for the repetition, the reoccurrence not to happen. And our concern is if we don't do so, we will see that happen again.
The next time, Henny, you're so right, because the next time there'll be nothing left at the end. I mean, we're sitting at a point now where there's the rail infrastructure in both the Western Cape and Gauteng has collapsed. There are hundreds of thousands of people who relied on that to get to work and back every day. So these are real consequences, and these corporates can't just hide, hide in their ivory towers and not face any consequences or any sanction. But back to the NPA and the Hawks, Henny. What do you think what's the way forward? Because we've spoken in depth about what's happened and about the situation at the moment. What does Open Secrets recommend going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Natasha. I mean, I think from our work at Open Secrets and Raisa and colleagues have come forward with some really strong recommendations. The forefront of our mind in all of this work is the issue of human rights, is the fact that 9 million South Africans won't have enough food to eat today. So as you say, there isn't already enough for many folks. And in fact, if we look at the number of folks on social grants for most folks in our country just to eke out a living. And so there's an urgency in terms of action. You spoke earlier about the NDPP, for example, just like General Libya being relatively new in their job. But, at some point you've got to say, you've been through 3, maybe 4 summers already. When are we going to see some kind of harvest from the crops that you say that you're planting? Because thus far, we've seen very little to nothing. And so what we do need to see is a proper investigation, firstly, of the incompetent and corrupt prosecutors. And secondly, the same process needs to take place within the police officers and the Hawks to ensure that those individuals that Raisa has, I think, spoken to very clearly, that this report names, and many of those names are in the public, although we have some more new details now, that those folks are investigated and prosecuted. I think a golden rule that one would argue, particularly in any law enforcement that has this extraordinary power, is that you go the hardest against the people in your own ranks that have committed crimes against the state. Now, you've got to ask yourself, if we hear from the NDPP and others, and I know that they may have a somewhat brittle ego at times, so when you say this, they feel that they're under personal attack, but they need to recognize that the Republic is under attack when folks who have committed crimes are not held to account in their own ranks. They do not do anything to remedy the many problems that we face as a country. And so the question is, we firstly are saying, get behind the effective prosecution and the removal of those folks through disciplinary actions. That it's hard work, but guess what? You're paid good salaries, and some of the best salaries, certainly even better than in some corporates, to do this kind of work within the public service as the top leadership of all of these institutions. And we need to see that those individuals that you've named and others have named are in fact held to account, and we need transparency around that process. Then I think that the third element that we want to ensure, that we want to see more competent investigators and prosecutors that should be recruited. It can't be, again, that we keep that for very long, this deadwood like Tory Pretorius and others who've bungled countless numbers of cases, were kept in the NPA until they then retire on a handsome state pension. And we're not letting the good people, like, I'll use, one of the listeners today who said, well, how can I help? It's exactly the skills of those kind of folks that we need to see in the public service making a difference, that are recruited. Yes, they say they're bringing in a new cohort of people. Well, we want to know that you're bringing in the best, smartest folks. And the state has done this, I think, Natasha. We remember in the 2000s, when the Scorpions were created, there was an attempt to go out and say, we want the country's best and brightest, and we're going to bring them into these institutions, and we want them to be proud to be making a difference in our democracy. And I don't think we've seen that kind of drive and commitment from the NPA and the Hawks. And as long as they don't follow through, they're not going to bring in the good folks. If they don't follow through and are consistent in even holding these corrupt people in their own ranks to account, why will good, young, smart people go and work in institutions like the NPA or the Hawks or others for the matter? So that's why we need to see that kind of consequence. And then, of course, there's the issue of we need greater transparency. I think that we are certainly just don't see that necessarily from either the Hawks or the NPA. We've seen most recently this week The Hawks came out, as you said, Natasha. We had General Labia talking about, giving us some pieces of information for the first time, I think, and I don't know how long, around some of the big corruption cases they're working on. The NDPP did the same thing finally about a month ago, together with Minister Lamola at the end of July. Those are important signs, but we need these things to happen regularly. The public needs to be updated on where they are with many of the big matters and cases, and you can't continue to fudge the detail. Let me use one example, Natasha. This week, when General Labia was asked about money that the Hawks had been given by Steinhoff to investigate Steinhoff, we shouldn't forget, so the Steinhoff officials, he was asked how much money have the Hawks in fact been given by Aldrin Sampear on SAFM, and he simply couldn't answer the question. And these facts matter. These officials have asked the questions over and time again, and I use that as an example that you can't continue to dodge this, because it has an implication on issues of public trust. And then the last point to raise is that it's very clear that we need to see the investigation and prosecution of major corruption cases. We've seen right now 0 instances of corruption being investigated or rather successfully prosecuted for state capture. We worry that it's going to be quick fixes with out-of-court settlements and other opaque measures to try and argue that there have been victories. But to make the last point, we've heard, for example, the NDPP say repeatedly, and we've got this on record going back some years now, give us 6 months, give us 6 months. We heard in September, which is, by the way, I think that's next week, we were going to see 9 seminal cases being prosecuted by the NPA. I think on your pages today, Natasha, in the Financial Mail, we hear the NDPP saying that she's going to follow one case, and all she can tell us is that she can't tell us what that case is. So I think our fear, and this is not to sow distrust in the institution, but at some point I think we all feel a little bit like we are being led, we're being led by political type arguments from public servants who should be telling us what they are doing, how they're doing, so we can measure their performance. You can't only promise things, you have to deliver, and delivery for you, for the Hawks, for the NPA rather, means accountability. And I think that's what we need to see. So I think those are our key recommendations in this investigative report.
Thanks for that, Henny. Transparency is key, because they may well be doing all of the things that you are recommending. They may well be investigating Chaoke and others. They may well be disciplining them, but we don't know that. And that's the difficulty. We have a comment from Tobani, who says he was expecting someone from the NDPP to participate. Raisa, when she compiled the report, Tobani did reach out to the NPA, sent them detailed questions, and did include some of their responses. So please go and get that report. If you look through it, you will find references to what the NPA has said with regards to all of these matters. And another issue is Raisa's report relies heavily on the NPA's own information by its current CEO, head of administration, Karen van Rensburg. So yeah, please do read the report. You will find some responses to from the NDPP there. And another question from Glenda. I just want to ask you about this, Henny. The NPA has the aspirant prosecutors program, where you were talking about bringing the skills, get creative about bringing in young, dynamic people, get the best of the best. But we know that government is not an attractive place to work for the best of the best, because of issues like state capture, because of issues like political meddling, political interference, because of what prosecutors faced who tried to prosecute Richard Ndluli, for instance. We know Gerrie Nel and Willie Hofmeyer are no longer with the NPA because of these things. So what do you have to say to young aspirant prosecutors who may want to enter but who are a bit nervous because of what we're telling them about how toxic the environment potentially is?
Yeah, I think Natasha, I think it's an important question. One doesn't want to dissuade folks who want to make a difference to get into government and to help change things. But I think we also can't sugarcoat what's going on, and that's, I think, is our challenge. I think what we need to hear from young lawyers and others who are working in various, from student bodies to elsewhere, need to be calling out these institutions that have the power to hold their own people in their own rank account. They have the resources. They even supposedly have the political capital. That means they've got, they're not beholden to that political power, but quite frankly, they've got a Minister of Justice and a president who, at least on paper and what they've said in Parliament, are supposedly behind a new dawn cleanup moment, the political capital has been theirs to spend. And again, I think those comments should make us recognize that the good young folks don't want to go into these institutions if the older folks who have all the leadership positions and all the resources don't do their jobs. And they should recognize that this is a consequence of their inaction. And I think that is an incredibly powerful message in our society. If we give up on the public service and we walk away from it, there's certain things that we rely on the state on a daily basis to look after some of our basic needs, to ensure that when we're in a vulnerable position, that we have the state there to assist us in different ways. And we abdicate a really important space, not only in public life, but for all of us as individuals living in this country. So I think it's crucial that this is another reason why we need to put pressure on the NPA, so that people like that want to join that aspirant, the Young Prosecutors Program. I've spoken to young prosecutors who have gone in there and have left because they've certainly felt that in the slice of the work that they were doing in institutions like the NPA, and I'm using that as an example, and certainly within the Hawks as well, is that they just don't believe that they can see anything moving. It's not a question of ego that they need to control, making things happen. They look at their senior colleagues and they don't see the colleagues moving things along. And so, I think that should be a wake-up call to all of us, that we need to change those things precisely so that the young folks, the best and the brightest in our country, need to get into the public institutions and serve the interests of the public in the way we would wish them to.
I think it's all our responsibility to help rebuild after the traumatic period we've been through. Just one last thing before we go, Raisa, what are you working on next?
So we have a few investigations down the line. One involves a tycoon in a nation very close to us, and another involves some property estate agents potentially down the line. So we're working on some exciting stuff. And I think the most exciting thing about our work to come is that it doesn't just revolve around South Africa, but other parts of the world and the continent as well. So yeah, looking forward to those.
Fantastic. We'll watch out for those. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Raisa and Henny, for this report, and hopefully we can put some pressure on the powers that be, and hopefully we can see the ball rolling a little bit faster. I mean, yes, Ismail is in court, but he's not behind bars if he's guilty. So let's keep putting pressure to see that we rebuild our institutions and get our country moving again. Thank you so much.